just that acceptance is so priceless. And that frees us from being stuck. So when we're fighting with ourselves, when we're at odds with ourselves, oh, how painful. But when we can begin to accept ourselves, even our defeat, to accept ourselves as we are, that's where we begin.
Welcome to Season of Stuck, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the all too human experience of feeling stuck. I'm your host, Deanna and on this podcast, we explore all things stuck. How and why stuckness happens, what it feels like, how to learn and grow from it, and ultimately, how to get unstuck and move forward in an authentic, empowered way. If you are looking for insights, support, and community as you make your journey from stuck to unstuck, you're in the right place. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Season of Stuck. I am your host, Deanna. If this is your first time listening, welcome to the podcast. And if this is not your first time listening, welcome back. I can't say enough how much I appreciate you being here and how much it means to me to be a part of your journey from stuck to unstuck. So thank you for tuning in and for letting me be a part of that journey. So today we are going to talk about an emotional experience that is intricately tied to stuckness, and that is shame. In my opinion and experience, shame is one of the emotions that is most likely to lead to feelings of stuckness. It's heavy, it's immobilizing, it's sticky. And when you're in the thick of it, it can be hard to see a way out, let alone figure out how to move towards that way out. Now, before we get too deep into shame and the stuckness that goes along with it, I think it's important to touch on what shame is and what shame isn't. Because oftentimes we equate feelings of shame with feelings of guilt. But there are subtle but important differences between the two. I've heard it described like this. Guilt manifests as, I've done something wrong, while shame manifests as, I am something wrong. Guilt can be helpful. It can act as a kind of moral check engine light, letting us know when we've done or said something that is out of line with our values and who we want to be, which can then motivate us to make things right and change our behavior to avoid doing or saying those things in the future. Shame, on the other hand, is the opposite of helpful. When you're stuck in shame, you feel like the shame is you, that you yourself are something bad. And when you believe that you are, at the core, bad or shameful, it can be really, really hard to make steps in any sort of positive direction, or really any direction at all. I am very familiar with shame. I've experienced shame in so many different ways at so many different times of my life. For example, I felt so much shame around my drinking. At a certain point, drinking stopped feeling like something that I did and started feeling like something that I was. I felt like a loser, a screw-up, a person that was destined to fail. I felt like there was something wrong with me in a fundamental core identity type way. And that drove a lot of shame. I've also felt shame around my body. I've done a lot of work on accepting and embracing and loving myself exactly as I am, work that I still continue to do. But for years, whenever I would look in the mirror, all I would see were flaws and imperfections and things that I wished were different. And an overwhelming feeling of shame would soon follow. And recently, I felt shame around the balancing act that is adulting. Shame tells me that I should be able to do and have it all, that I should have a thriving business and see my friends multiple times a week and exercise every day and eat a perfect clean diet and carve out time for self-care and be the perfect partner and daughter and friend and sister and creator and writer, and I should be that perfect self all the time. And when I inevitably cannot balance all of those shoulds, I feel shame for falling short, and then lean into the story that the reason I'm falling short is that I am just not a capable person. And when I'm in the midst of shame, I often find myself in shame spirals, constant and obsessive thought loops that have my inner critic telling me everything from what a failure I am to how I'll never amount to anything to all the reasons why I'm a terrible person, and insert pretty much whatever self critical or judgmental thought you can think of here. And in those shame spirals, I feel completely stuck. I'm so stuck in my thoughts that I can't take any action. And because I'm not taking any action, I get stuck in the stories that are making me feel shame. And then there's the more insidious version of shame, that nagging feeling that something is off or wrong about you. For me, it's this idea that I am just not enough, not worthy enough, not smart enough, not successful enough, not creative enough, just not enough. And I don't know about you, but that type of shame might be the one that I find the most difficult because it's not tied to anything specific or tangible. It's just this internal, ever present hunch that I'm not enough. And no matter how hard I try, I will never be enough. And it's like, how do you get unstuck from that? As you can see, shame can be a very stuck emotion. And it can also be a really complex one, especially when you start peeling back the layers to figure out what exactly is the source of that shame. What expectations do we feel like we're falling short of? And where exactly did those expectations come from? For example, why do I feel like my body needs to look or be a certain way in order to feel worthy? Where did I get this completely ridiculous and unrealistic idea that every area of my life needs to be perfect and that they all need to be perfect at the same time? Why have so many of my internal stories over the course of my life been about how I am fundamentally flawed or unworthy or falling short of the ideal? Because the frustrating thing is, I don't even believe these things. Like, I would never judge anyone else according to the ridiculous standards that I sometimes have for myself. So, if those standards aren't mine, whose are they? Now, like I said, I've done a lot of work around shame, but there is definitely still work to be done. And I wanted to learn more about it, how shame can manifest, where it comes from, how it can keep us stuck both at the individual and the cultural level, and most importantly, what we can do to get unstuck from shame and live more open and free lives. And that is what brought me to today's guest. Melissa Petro is a journalist whose writing has appeared in outlets like The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and Cosmopolitan. She's also an author. Her recent book, Shame on You: How to Be a Woman in the Age of Mortification, is an exploration of our current culture of shame and how that shame-centric culture disproportionately impacts women. During our conversation, Melissa and I take a deep dive into the connection between shame and stuckness, including why shame is such a stuck-making emotional experience, the cultural messages and expectations that drive shame, and how those messages and expectations can keep us stuck, and how to stop fighting and start changing our relationship to shame and get unstuck in the process. Also, if you want to access key takeaways as well as actionable tips on how to apply the insights from this episode to your own journey from stuck to unstuck, just visit seasonofstuck.com/subscribe and sign up for our newsletter, where you will get new episodes as well as takeaways and tips from those episodes delivered to your inbox each week. Okay, let's jump into my conversation with Melissa. Melissa, welcome to Season of Stuck. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am so excited to chat with you today. Your book takes a deep dive into a topic that I think is so important for everyone, but particularly for women in today's culture, and that is shame. And I don't know if there is anything that keeps you more stuck than shame does. So I'm just really excited to explore this topic with you.
Right, agreed. I mean, at the beginning of the book, I talk about the shame spiral, which is really definition of stuckness, right? You're just Oh, the behavior begets behavior, feelings beget feelings, and I always picture a tire just spiraling in the mud.
Oh, I am familiar with the
You've
shame
been
spiral. Can
there.
confirm it is very stuck making. I guess to kick things off, I would love if you could introduce yourself to the listeners and also tell us a little bit about your work and your recent book, Shame on You: How to Be a Woman in the Age of Mortification.
Sure. My name's Melissa Petro. I'm a cultural journalist and author of Shame on You: How to Be a Woman in the Age of Mortification. It's a prescriptive nonfiction, part memoir, part call to action, call to all the things that we've been feeling and yearning to better understand, at least myself and the people I love, the women I keep closest. The book really started with this idea of a feeling of not enoughness that really plagued my cohort of friends. So a couple of years ago, I really dug into that feeling, and out came this book.
I really love the description of shame as this feeling of not enoughness. I've always been so surprised. I think for myself, when I get stuck in shame, it feels like it makes sense because I feel like I'm not enough. But then when I look at these other women in my life, women that I admire, women that I think are fantastic, women that are just, I mean, objectively amazing, and then they feel like not enough. It's a really clear reminder that this not enough feeling is not a personal thing.
And it's untrue. I mean, that was really the impetus for the book, because I could see these women who were just like objectively killing it, who just didn't feel, really focused on their flaws and perceived failures rather than all the success. And I just really needed to understand where that was coming from, because it wasn't personal. It wasn't me who hadn't sold a book yet at that time, because here was someone with two books who also felt unseen and ignored and professionally just falling behind. And, I couldn't really understand where it was coming from. If it wasn't me, and it's definitely not her, where did that inner critic, who implanted that? And so the book sought to answer that question.
Well, let's jump into that question. So, at kind of a foundational level, let's establish from your perspective, like what exactly is shame and how does it manifest both personally and in our culture today?
So we think of shame, oftentimes we think of those deep, dark secrets that just create a certain inignorable self-loathing, like really like the big ones. And those I explore in the book. Addiction, or oftentimes traumas that we've experienced, or the real stigmatized experiences that we carry, taboo type identities, all of those things. Obviously that's an aspect of shame, but what I also realized, that definition of not enoughness, we don't really think of it as self-loathing, but that feeling of inadequacy that motivates us, that spurs us to do more, to be more. Well, that's really saying we're not enough and we haven't done enough. But not just that we haven't done enough, we're not enough. The definition of shame is really not what you've done, it's who you are. That's wrong. And if it's just a behavior, you can feel guilty. But if it's a fundamental aspect of yourself that you can't change, you can only hide, that's something we feel ashamed of. So oftentimes it's below our consciousness that we think, there's something about me that's just not quite enough. It's not, I am inadequate. I'm wrong. And I'm just going to either really try to outrun this so no one notices, or I'll hide it. And that's really what motivates a lot of us personally, especially women. And culturally, we really, Brené Brown dubbed ours a culture of shame 20 years ago, and it's just as true today. We are all just trying to outdo ourselves and each other to our own exhaustion, because we're trying to outrun that feeling. And the truth is, spoiler alert, you're going to feel it. It's going to be there whether you feel it or not. And if you don't feel it, it has such an insidious and detrimental impact on our lives. So it's better to just turn around and face it.
Yeah. And I think I resonated with everything that you just said. I 100% have felt all of those things. And I've done a good amount of work of like peeling back that layers and being like, what exactly is this? Why do I feel like no matter how much I achieve, no matter how much I do, I am always falling short of some ideal version of myself and my life, that no matter what I do, I can't seem to get there. And I think for women of my age, I'll be 40 in a couple of weeks. I think that we were really sold this idea of having it all, that not only can we have it all, but we should have it all, that we should have the perfect family and the perfect job and the perfect home and the perfect career. And that is a fallacy. And when you inevitably can't have a perfect life, I think it kicks in this feeling of, well, I must be doing something wrong. And then I must be doing something wrong turns into, I must be something wrong. There is something wrong with me that is keeping me from having this ideal life that is available for everyone else. And then the shame spiral kicks in.
That's it. And I do think it's particular to our generation because not only did we kind of grow up with that, you can have it all, just lean in messaging, but we were also given the messaging that we ought to be critical and smarter than that messaging. So I talk about the notion of having it all in my chapter on marriage and motherhood. And I interview one woman who just so brilliantly said, I know I'm supposed to be smarter than this. And yet still, I really do. And actually, I did speak to a lot of women who just said, no, I don't fall for that trap. But I think if we're being more genuine, we really do. And then we beat ourselves up for wanting that. And why do we want that? Because we're on social media. We're constantly getting this messaging that this is what your life is supposed to look like. And from that, we assume this is what our life is supposed to feel like. And that our reality just does not match up to that expectation. And what you just said is absolutely correct. When we fall short of our expectations, enter shame. And that feeling of something's wrong, it's me. And we really don't know what other people's lives look like. And we don't know what, as they say, we compare our insides to people's outsides. And I think what the book really encourages is first to break down our own walls, to recognize the truths of our experience, and to just turn on the lights and look into those darkest corners and see what we're afraid of, because it's not so scary once the lights are on and you're just facing it. It's a lot less scary. Like, okay, so I'm imperfect in these ways, these very human ways. So we start there, and then we start to look at other people's lives, not in a critical or judgmental way, but just in a truth-seeking way. And you'll see that this is a human experience, and it looks very different than we think it's supposed to look.
So it sounds like there are a number of cultural elements that contribute to personal feelings of shame, including this idea that we are supposed to have it all and be super successful and have every area of our life and be perfect, as well as the social media shame machine, which instigates comparison. And I've heard it like referred to as comparing your full movie to someone else's highlight reel, right? Like seeing the happiest, most exciting, most curated moments of other people's lives and then comparing it to the mundane, challenging, boring, hard moments of your own, which can then make you feel shame that your entire life is not like a highlight reel. And that instigates those feelings. It influences those feelings of shame. I'm not enough. I'm not doing it right. And when we are in that place, when we're in a shame spiral, when our inner critic is being so loud and just has an opinion on everything that we're doing, in what ways can that shame keep us stuck?
Right. So, like I've said, when you don't recognize it and you behave from your impulsive self, that primitive muscle just sort of kicks in, that survival mechanism. We're bound to behave in less emotionally intelligent ways. So that's why, we fight, we hide, we run away, we avoid that feeling. And those avoidant behaviors oftentimes create more trouble than solve any solutions, right? So that's when, you're feeling down on yourself. And so you pick a fight with your sister. And now you've got to fight with your sister to contend to, and also whatever had caused you to feel down on yourself to begin with. So that feeling of spiraling is really, oftentimes it has this initial source, but that's just what initially sets it off. And then our own behaviors then contribute to our feelings of wrongness. And it can become really hard to disentangle, because what's true is that we make choices. And when we do behave badly, oftentimes, we want to hold ourselves account for that. But if we can't recognize what instigates the feeling initially and realize what we're not responsible for and sort of really take an honest account, then we can't really change our behavior. So that's why some people talk about shame as being a positive, motivating emotion to really compel people to do better. And it's socially constructive because it compels individuals to behave in pro-social ways. There's that belief. And then there's a lot of experts, and including myself, who just don't believe that shame can be positive. We know this when we look at diet and research on diet, and we see that fat phobia and any kind of messages, shame inducing messages regarding weight and weight loss, don't result in long lasting healthy change in a person's life. And we know this personally. Like if you've ever tried to shame yourself into doing better, oftentimes it doesn't have a long lasting effect. When we think about children, if you shame a child into behaving differently, it might have an immediate effect. They may fawn in response to the shaming messages, but they don't learn a lesson or really internalize a new behavior. They don't feel empowered to act differently in the future. And that's what ultimately, as a society, if we shift away from shame as a mechanism of control towards a more compassionate, empathetic society that empowers individuals to do and be their best selves, then we're going to get the outcomes that we desire.
And I think that speaks a lot to the difference between guilt and shame. Whereas I'll just use myself as an example. So I struggled with alcohol use disorder for 6 years in my late teens and early 20s. And it was a terrible time. And I did things that I'm not proud of. And I lived in a way that is not in alignment with like my values and who I am as a person. And there was guilt about that, in that I was able to recognize, like, I am making decisions that are not good for me or good for the people around me or good for my long-term future. And that helped me to make changes, to be like, okay, like I'm doing something that is not great and I want to do something better. But the feelings of shame associated with it that stayed with me for years and years and years of like, I am something bad because I struggled with addiction. Those did nothing but hold me back. Those didn't help me build a new life. Those held me back from reaching my full potential because I felt as though there was something wrong with me, that there was this like almost like a disease inside that like I couldn't ever fix or fill, and that was going to permeate my entire life. And it wasn't until I worked through that shame that I was able to like build a life that felt like full and joyful and free. And so I think that difference of, I've heard it described as guilt is I did something bad and shame is I am something bad, in terms of like motivation, like recognizing that you're doing something that you're not stoked on can be helpful in changing behavior, but feeling that you are that negativity and that it's somehow tied to like who you are at the core as a person will keep you absolutely stuck.
Right. So in the book, I talk about desirable and unwanted identities. And it's a behavior becomes an identity. You don't just empowered to manage your home, you're a nag. And that's that in particular. And a lot of the identities I talk about in the book are feminized identities. It's one thing to be assertive, but it's another thing to be a bitch. And, what do we call women versus men? So we have a whole list of things that we're not supposed to be. And the second our behavior begins to kind of enter that area where one could be described as this, oh, you're a slut because you're sexually available. And we might even feel guilty, like maybe my sexual conduct isn't aligning with my ideals. But the second we become a slut, there's nothing you can do about that. That's just what you are. So you either have to hide that fact, even if you can behave differently to hide it, but you're not thinking in that, again, like that intelligent mind. Shame keeps us in this primitive place where we're just surviving. And our survival is really contingent on our feeling of belonging. So if we don't feel as if someone loves us or that we're lovable, we feel so ashamed as to be unlovable. No one's going to take care of us and keep us safe and protected. Whereas if we're knowledgeable that we're like worthy of protection and love and dignity and all those things, then we can say, okay, I'm a worthy being, but let me look at this conduct and see if there's a gap between how I'm behaving and how I aspire to behave. And then we can start to think more intelligently about the choices we're making. But we're not thinking that way when we're just identifying as this unwanted thing.
There are so many different ways to go from stuck to unstuck. But one of the most productive, learning. Learning something new can help you expand your skill set and find new interest, and in the process, help you get unstuck. And if you want to learn something new, you will definitely want to check out Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community that offers thousands of classes designed to help you learn, grow, and tap into your creativity, all of which can help you make the journey from stuck to unstuck. And right now, Skillshare is offering a free month to new members. If you want to access Skillshare's entire library of classes and get the education and instruction you need to shake off the stuckness, just visit seasonofstuck.com/Skillshare and sign up for your free trial today. Again, that's seasonofstuck.com/Skillshare. Now, I'm curious because obviously shame is universal. No one is impervious to experiencing shame or feelings of not enoughness or unworthiness. But it does seem disproportionate that women have more of these identities that are associated with shame. You know, the slut identity, the bitch identity, like all of these things that we are not supposed to be.
And oftentimes they're competing, right? Like you're not
Yeah.
supposed to be a slut, but you're also not supposed to be frigid or a prude. You're not supposed to be a bitch, but we are supposed to be, go girl kind of empowered women. So there's like a desirable identity and an unwanted one. And the line between the two is sometimes unclear.
Like you're supposed to be beautiful, but you're not supposed to be high maintenance.
Right. Everything's supposed to be effortless, but you're also supposed to like obviously live effortful all the time. And that's like an unspoken message, the go-getting mom, the power woman. Like it's these really shame enters when the expectations are competing in a way that just makes it impossible for us. So where do these messages come from and why? That's really what the book set out to look at. They really are gendered messages, as you've said. These are labels we prescribe to women mostly, and they're really a mechanism of social control. So women and other marginalized identities are defined as less than or othered or not quite right. This is the norm or the aspiration or the expectation, and you're just not living up to it. And you really got to try harder. And it's really a way I discovered personally when I became a mother, and it was impossible to live up to that ideal. And I was a stay-at-home mom, which is derided in its own way, but also working mothers are derided. If I loved my family too much, or if I was too selfish and kept hold of myself, I just found myself in this place where like I couldn't win. And then I really realized, that's exactly the place they want us to be in. Who's they? Like a heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacist culture where there's individuals benefiting and then there's individuals who are oppressed, and the benefit is contingent upon the oppression. So shame is wielded as a weapon to really keep women and other minorities in our place.
And what do you think is the driving force behind that? Is it capitalism, where it is making us feel less than so that we will buy products to more clearly align with what society tells us that we're supposed to be? Is it to keep us small so that we don't take action against this system that is keeping us oppressed? Like in your research and your experience, like from a systemic perspective, why do you think shame is being weaponized in our culture?
I'm going to say all of the above. Like when we think of who is most shamed, which categories of women really, arguably, I would say we're really shamed over our reproductive rights, or shamed out of them, and mothers. And really, what are we needed for most? Our invisible unpaid labor as mothers and caretakers, as wives and mothers in that heteronormative image. That's what we are expected to be. And then there are expectations attached to that. And everything else relies on that. in a capitalistic society. And then also, our reproductive abilities are being managed. And really, it's so insidious, shame, so powerful and powerfully persuasive that I keep saying they, and I had a developmental editor who was like, you can't do that, but we know who we mean. We know what we mean.
Yes.
We're talking about these oppressive institutions so skillfully have implanted the mechanism inside ourselves. So we don't have to, we've been conditioned in such a way to either just consciously or unconsciously believe the expectation or spend all of our time and energy resisting it, which really, as you said, keeps us just paralyzed and privatized in a way that undermines our ability as public beings. So instead of participating in our public lives and organizing politically, we're obsessed with whether or not our kitchen counters are clean and just fraught over the fact that we forgot our children's boots at drop off this morning.
And there truly is no way to opt out of it, because I'll use myself as an example. So I made the decision to not have children. So I'm married, I have dogs. We decided that the best decision for our family was just to not have children.
I love that.
And I love it too. I think that motherhood is an amazing thing, and I love children. I just don't want any living in my house necessarily. But the shame attached to being a childless woman.
Right. And I'm sure you have to explain that choice again and again, constantly out loud and to yourself, to your own exhaustion constantly.
Yes.
I never even considered that option because it was so insidiously just a fabric of a woman's experience. I took it for granted that I would have children. Now that I have children, I recognize why a woman would make that choice, why anyone would make the choice, but it didn't feel like a choice. And so many of the choices we make don't feel that way at all. And then if they do, if we're conscientiously objecting to the status quo, then you're going to be called on that nonstop.
100%. And to your point, I didn't feel like it was an option either. I assumed that I would have children. I assumed that I was going to follow the path of, I'm going to go to college, then I'm going to meet a partner, I'm going to get married, we're going to have kids, I'm going to have a job, I'm going to do the whole thing. And it wasn't until my partner and I started having deeper conversations that it was like, oh, there are other paths that I could potentially take, and it's okay for me to take the time to explore them. But the messaging that comes back, both at like a personal and a societal level, I've had people tell me that I am missing out on an experience that makes me fundamentally a woman. And then you turn on any news channel and we're just being called like childless cat ladies with like tumbleweeds in our wombs. And it's just like, it's crazy. But then if you do opt into the expectation, then you're shamed for other things. You're not being a good enough mom.
You can't win, right? And you can't escape it. And I really think, again, going back to our generation, because I'm in my 40s as well, we were really taught to just don't buy it, to just be shameless, like really don't let it hurt. But the truth is it does hurt constantly. It's impossible to escape that conditioning. I do think what you and your partner did, though, is really the call to action that the book starts to lean to in the last quarter, which is really like, we have to learn how to live differently. And not to say that you made the right choice, but you made a mindful choice that was right for you. And we can only begin to do that, to make mindful choices that are right for us, when we first recognize the feeling that we have. Defensiveness is a reaction to shame, more fawning. Like I said, instead of being reactive, we recognize the feeling. Then we can start to notice, okay, where does that come from? What is the message? What is the outside telling me that is in conflict with my inside or with who I think I am? What is the conflict? So developing a cultural awareness. After we recognize the feeling, we develop a cultural awareness, and then we start to have those conversations, those truthful conversations with people we trust that we can be vulnerable with, like you had with your partner. And you say, what are our values? And how do we live those values? What would our life look like? And it's not going to look like it's quote unquote supposed to look, because it's impossible. Even if we really leaned into describing the expectation, you can't be both. You can't be both a devoted stay-at-home mother and a work. I mean, you can, but it's going to be untidy. And that's what a real life looks like. It's messy, it's complicated. There's moments where we haven't made choice. So to admit our powerlessness in certain ways, these are all are leaning towards a wholehearted, empathetic life of vulnerability versus living in a culture of shame and participating in that machine.
So it sounds like a really important piece of the puzzle is being able to go inward and untangle what are my values and my wants and my needs versus the values and wants and needs I have been told that I am supposed to want. And then using that as like a compass towards building a life that actually feels like a reflection of you, not a reflection of this culture of shame.
I love that. And, there have been some of the most stuck moments of my life I've been released from in spite of the fact that there was no action I could take. I'm thinking of when my son was expelled. I think he was 4 by then. And he was diagnosed with a disability, or it was identified that he had a disability, and the public school could not accommodate him. And so he was placed in the most restrictive environment, which was homeschooling. So he could not go to school and he had to stay home. And I was charged with educating him, the child that the public school district said they could not educate. Now it's my response. And it was also implied that it was my fault because the disability presented as behavioral. So for 8 months total, I had to put everything else aside and just be with my ADHD 4-year-old for, 24 hours a day, but, educating him for 6. And it was not my choice. And there was enormous amounts of shame, as I've alluded to. And there was literally nothing I could do differently except to surrender to that powerlessness. I could not, in those moments, change that situation. I saw no solutions. And I felt how I felt. I couldn't not feel. I felt degraded. I was enraged. It was unjust. It was so wrong. And I couldn't do anything to make it right. And I think oftentimes that's really the shame of trauma. When we're in a situation where, and I'm not to say that situation was traumatic, but I've experienced traumatic situations as well, where we think we have some power over it and we feel ashamed that we didn't act differently. And I could say this about addiction because I'm also in recovery. I think the moment of surrender, when we realize that we are just powerless over something so much larger than ourselves, that's the moment that the clouds break. And it can feel, even though nothing else has changed. I remember the exact moment where the clouds broke for me, where I just accepted that this was our situation for now. It was months after that we finally parentally placed him in a private program and began to sue for reimbursement. Fight again. But, just that acceptance is so priceless. And that frees us from being stuck. So when we're fighting with ourselves, when we're at odds with ourselves, oh, how painful, right? But when we can begin to accept ourselves, even our defeat, to accept ourselves as we are, that's where we begin to be better, ironically.
It is a humbling but powerful moment to relinquish control because, in many ways, control can be a shame response. If I am able to control all of the elements of what's happening right now, I can construct this situation in a way that doesn't trigger my shame and my feelings of unworthiness and my feelings of not enoughness. But sometimes, no matter how hard we try to control something, it's just, we can't. And we just have to accept. And that is the liberation.
It's so ironic to say that in recovery, there's that phrase, piece of shit in the center of the universe. To say it's all my fault, to say you're in complete control. Who is so arrogant to believe that it's not all our fault because you're not in complete control. So yeah. And then I'm so grateful that I qualified for a 12-step program because that's the beginning of 12-step, that admittance that we are powerless over whatever, and then so many things, because that was really, really hard for me to do. So long as I felt like I couldn't do it on my own, and if I didn't, that was on me. And I can still be that way, right? Because it's really about doing that every day, right? And that's really admitting this. It takes a lot of humility. So humiliation and humility, they're like right there next to each other. But when I can just lean into the humility that I do not have all the answers, I do not know what will happen next. Maybe I even do feel afraid. Then I can begin to take more honest action.
And what we're talking about really is changing our relationship to shame, changing the way that we think about and relate to shame on a personal level and at a societal level. So, from your research and your experience, how does that help us get unstuck? Like, how does changing our relationship to shame help us move through the stuckness and get to a more free, unstuck place?
Right. So when we're fighting shame, we're ignoring the actual issue. So when we're at odds with ourself and our perceived worthlessness, we're not addressing our actions and our behaviors. We're not really living it out loud. We're stuck in our own kind of prison of self. So it really begins with that surrender and putting down that fight. People relate differently to shame. I'm a fighter. I just think I'm going to fight that feeling. I'm going to fight what's making me feel that way. And I'm just going to be at war. Sometimes in a proactive way, but sometimes in an irrational or an unintelligent way. It's not necessarily an intelligent fight when it's driven by a shame, especially unconscious shame. So other people will react differently. People shut down, people adapt avoidant behaviors, or people fawn, just try to say whatever they need to say in order to please the perceived shame, where the message is coming from. So depending on what your impulse is when you're feeling shamed, all of those behaviors aren't truly addressing the issue or taking an intelligent action to resolve the problem, assuming there is one. So when we start to recognize our behavioral pattern, our habit, so that we can, instead of behaving in that habitual way, we begin to investigate that behavior so that we can start to behave more intelligently, then you're going to have a more intelligent response. We came from a generation, I think, where we were really taught to just deny shame, to feel shameless. So we weren't doing this sort of, recognize and investigate a feeling and then react from that, or act from that, I should say. We were also taught that shame is bad. So if shame is the enemy and we're going to avoid it and we're going to pretend we don't feel it because we're smarter than that, that we're missing out on a lot of information about ourselves and our world. So once we start to shift to a place of curiosity about shame, now we're gathering information about ourselves and our world that we can use to take action. Something really brilliant, though, happened to me when I was writing the book. This was like third level reframing. I realized that shame isn't the enemy, but in fact, and this was like really, wow, it was friendly in a sense for me because it was trying to protect me. And I didn't realize this until after the book was like turned in and I was having feelings about my author photo, and that I probably felt shame over what I looked like, but also shame that I felt shame, one of those situations. But I realized I was trying to protect myself from criticism. Like I was anticipating judgment. And that's not irrational. That feeling, it's kind of like a big sister stepping in. And actually, there's an interviewee who said something very similar in the self-love chapter, that her relationship to shame, like a super evolved relationship to shame. She says that when shame enters the chat, she listens to it. And then she says, I hear you. And then she says, you can go. I hear you, but I'm okay. And I had that conversation with myself and my shame over the author photo because I was able to say, all right, I hear your fears. And that could happen, but it'll be okay. I got this. I got it. I got this. Thank you. I have this. And that was like radical to really befriend the shame, to hear it like someone who loves me.
Well, and that's huge because oftentimes, I'll just speak about my experience. The pieces of myself and my experience that I try to suppress end up getting louder and louder and louder. But like, because your shame, to your point, is just trying to get the floor. They're trying to tell you something. And if you can listen and acknowledge and stay grounded in that evolved adult part of your brain where it's like, I hear you, I see you, I recognize your concerns, but you don't have to do so much work. Like, I've got this and I will take care of us.
Right. And sometimes we can even recognize the shame coming at us in that way. Oftentimes, as parents, we shame our children out of love, we think, because we want them to be safe. And we think that we can shame them into behaving in pro social ways that will ultimately keep them safe. It's reactive. It's probably how we were parented, but it's ultimately ineffective. It's not the most effective way to teach our children. Fear is a terrible teacher, is a Big Little Feelings quote, the content creators, and it really is. If you're making a child feel bad about themselves, they're not going to feel inspired to do good, right? And same for us. We're not going to rise. We're going to fall and hide. But oftentimes we do get shaming messages from others because that person is trying to control our behavior for their own goods, but sometimes they think for your own good. And if we can accept messages, one, really critically hear where that message is coming from. Sometimes, oh, you want me to buy something. Okay, well, you sell products, you want me to buy something. And so you're trying to like trigger my feelings of inadequacy. I see you. Are you a Buddhist?
I have like explored Buddhism, yes.
Okay. So you might know the idea of Mara. So when Buddha was becoming Buddha, the Mara came to visit him and enticed him with all of the enticements, and he would recognize the enticements. So, I see you. I see that trigger, and I don't have to be enticed to feel inadequate. I recognize why you want me to feel that way. And then sometimes it's for my own good, you think, and sometimes it's for your own good. But I don't have to be affected or dysregulated. And obviously, and sometimes I am.
All of us, let's be real.
Right. And that's really when we talk about shame resilience, is what we try to develop that ability to be oneself, regardless of the messages that are impacting us. And regardless of the shame, we can feel the shame and it can pass through us rather than absorbing it and holding on to it.
Melissa, I feel like you have shared so much invaluable insight and tips on shame and our relationship with shame and how to get unstuck with shame. For anyone listening who is resonating with this and realizing, like, oh, I've got some shame stuff that is keeping me stuck, what are like the top pieces of advice that you would give them for starting their journey of like untangling themselves from the shame and getting unstuck as a result?
Awesome. So if this is resonating, or you even entered, like you turned on the podcast with that thing, like you saw the word shame and you knew how you could relate. Let's say you can relate. And this is also true for like super shame resilient folks. What do I do when I see, oh, I've got that thing? I know I've got to find someone that I can share that story with. Even today, when I behave in a way that does not live up to my ideals, or I'm defensive against something from the outside that threatens to make me feel shamed, I look for someone I can trust. And I have them everywhere. I'm really, really privileged to do this work as like my profession. So I practice all the time. I tell the story of the difficult drop off, or the fight with my husband, or the awkward email exchange with the boss. I talk about it, and then I talk about it again, and I talk about it again until I can tell that story like completely neutrally. I tell it again and again. So if you're in that place where you've got that thing that needs to be seen, show it. And if you don't have a therapist, have a therapist. If you don't have friends that are safe containers, find a group, a church, a 12-step program or a different form of recovery, of secular Buddhism. They have groups. You find a group of people that can just hold space for you and your experience in a non-judgmental, neutral kind of way. And that was my saving grace, was finding rooms that I could enter where I could just say anything. Writing workshops. Before that, my journal. I could say anything in it and write myself to a more intelligent place. Just keep saying it until I figured out that higher truth. And that's really how we develop shame resilience, because next time it won't impact us so hard because we'll have this experience. That's how we develop shame resilience. And that's how we stay in an affirmed place, because it's a daily practice. Like, no one is shame resistant. We're just having our human experience, and this is the practice.
Those are such good tips. Thank you so much for sharing. Melissa, this conversation has been incredible. I feel like I am walking away with a new perspective on how I relate to shame and some new strategies for the next time I inevitably find myself stuck in shame. So thank you for sharing those things. For anyone listening who wants to connect with you or learn more about your book or your work, how do they go about doing that?
I have a great website, melissa-petro.com. You can find out information about classes I teach or anything there. I'm on social media, Instagram.
Perfect. I just have one more question for you. This is a question that I love to ask all of my Season of Stuck guests. So, thinking about the ideal future version of yourself, the future Melissa that you're working every day to one day grow into, if she could travel back in time and talk to the present day, current version of Melissa, what advice do you think that she would give you on how to navigate stuckness at this point of your life?
It's so funny because I love that question so much. I want to answer it honestly. And I'm also a professional authority. And that was such a moment I had to experience in writing the book too. Am I going to be real, or am I going to be authority, at like the trusted version of myself? Definitely future me would step in right now and be like, shh, 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 shh. And she would offer this advice. She would say, just, you don't have to overthink this.
That, I think, future Deanna would be in alignment with future Melissa. Agree. So I'm going to take that advice and put it in my pocket and take it with me as well. So thank you, future Melissa. And thank you, current Melissa. I so appreciate you being here. Thank you for coming on the show and for sharing all of your incredible insight.
Thank you.
That's it for today. A huge thank you to our guests for their incredible insights, and a huge thank you to you, our listeners. We know that there are so many podcasts out there to choose from, and we are just so grateful that you chose ours. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider recommending the podcast to a friend or family member that you think would enjoy it. And to make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. And while you're there, if you loved the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review. It plays such a huge part in getting this podcast out to a wider audience and ultimately supporting more people on their journey from stuck to unstuck. And to keep in touch and access even more stuck-related content, follow us on Instagram at Season of Stuck and visit our website, seasonofstuck.com, where you can sign up to get episodes delivered directly to your inbox. Thank you again for being here. It is so, so appreciated. Until next time, I'm Deanna DeBera, and you're listening to Season of Stuck.